So let me start talking about my interactions with Masao a little bit, and then start talking about my subject, which is economics. And I somehow try to relate that to what I've learned or what I've been influenced by Masao. And Stefan came up to me like 20 minutes ago and asked me, are you really talking about economics today? So I said, yes, I will be talking about economics. But before that, let me mention a little bit about Masao. And I have been invited to a Freeman lecture at Wesleyan University this year. So I was looking at the list of lectures given in the past, and I found a familiar name of Masao Miyoshi, who gave a talk on bashing that John mentioned the other day. I haven't read the lecture yet, but I should, so that I know how far I can go in that lecture. I haven't given them the title yet, so after I will think about it after I read Masao's lecture. When I got to UCSD as a rookie assistant professor, that's a long time ago, as Stefan alluded to, there were three famous figures in the Japanese studies: John Dower, Chalmers Johnson, who was a colleague of mine at IRPS, International Relations and Pacific Studies, and Masao Miyoshi in literature. John left after a couple of years, I believe, so I didn't get to interact with him very much. Chao, even though he was a colleague of mine, pretty much left me alone because I'm just a simple-minded economist. I'm glad Sheila is not here to listen to that. But Masao didn't leave me alone. He knew I was just a simple-minded economist, but he didn't care. He wanted to talk about the things that he was interested in that had something to do with my field, like globalization, inequality, education, environment, and issues in the Japanese economy, and sometimes more broadly, the Japanese society. And one thing that I found through my interaction with Masao is that he's a very good listener. He seemed to be, or at least he seemed to be interested in what I'm talking about. And he asked me questions, and he appeared to care about what I say, my answers. And of course, as many of you know, and many of you mentioned, he challenged me and encouraged me to think beyond the usual mainstream economics, which I work on. So I guess he invited me to trespass. And of course, I refused. And I stayed in economics. But I think the conversation with him influenced my research in a subtle way. So Stefan told me that people are supposed to pick papers, or one paper or two, from Masao's trespasses, or any other papers he did, and develop a talk from here. So I picked his lecture, Japan is Not Interesting, because I remember he was talking about this title and when he was about to give these lectures. And my initial reaction to the title, before I read anything and before I heard more from him, was I totally disagree. This was back in late 1990s and 2000. And I thought Japan was interesting. And to explain this, I need to go back actually further to my graduate student days. I was studying economics and in the 1980s. And in the graduate study, I focused on what we call macroeconomics, which is the subject of a study of the fluctuations of the aggregate economy, which includes unemployment issues, inflation, exchange rate, things like that. And for a macroeconomics student in the 1980s, Japan was boring. And also, the Japan in the 1980s and before that, during the rapid economic growth period, Japan was boring. And Japan was growing at some high rate every year. without any serious problems of inflation, unemployment. And so I often envied my friends from Latin America, which had very interesting economies of high unemployment, hyperinflations, all of those things that excite our profession. But in the 1990s, after the collapse of the so-called bubble economy, Japan got interesting. It started to be interesting. So we started to observe so many economic problems, like financial crisis, prolonged recession, and increasing unemployment rate, especially for younger generations. We also started to see something we thought only possible in economic theory, but not in the real economy, like liquidity trap, threat of deflation spiral. I'm not sure if you know what those mean, but you have heard those words. And we thought those were just a theoretical possibility, which cannot happen in the modern economy, that happened in Japan. So Japan was very interesting. And even today, Japan continues to be interesting. And also, the US and Europe are getting very interesting too. The world economy is too interesting in a sense, and scary these days, but that's a subject for a different talk, maybe at Wesleyan. So back to my reaction to Masao's piece of Japan is not interesting. So I thought I would write a paper titled Japan is Now Interesting. I'm now glad that I didn't write the paper because I now see, in the sense Masao meant, as far as I can understand, in the sense Masao meant in this paper, Japan was indeed not interesting, even in the 1990s, during the financial crisis and repeated recessions, and even today. The Japanese economy was not interesting in the sense that I think Masao argued, and that being uninteresting in that sense is at the core of the long stagnation of the Japanese economy. So Japan has been in the stagnation for a long time because I think the Japanese economy wasn't interesting in the sense Masao uses in his talk. So now I start talking about economics. But I try to make the discussion accessible to non-economists, so you don't have to worry about it. If you know economics, there will be 2 or 3 equations in my talk, but if you don't know economics, you don't feel it. Okay. So the title of the talk on this program, which I think I made up before I came up with the content, is Japan Interesting? And I think Stefan added something to that, something economics. But the title I came up with is Japan Interesting? So I will just start out by giving you my answer. My answer is no. Japan remains not interesting. And the key reason why Japan is not interesting, according to Masao's paper, coming back to Masao's paper, is its lack of critical discourse. Okay? Of course, we economists don't use the word critical discourse in a paper or in a discussion. We may not be engaging in critical discourse, but that's another story. So Masao, in this paper, in this lecture, talks about many people, novelists, corporate executives, scholars, housewives, and homeless, express disenchantment about Japan, but he says, quote, "It is as of now not articulated. The assumption of anonymity is still dominating in Japan. Dissent and protest are discouraged. The ideology of homogeneity suppresses critical disclosure." So those are I think, to be the main argument of the Masao's paper and why Japan is not interesting. And in economics, even though we don't use the word critical discourse, we have, I think, something similar. And that is the concept of economic restructuring or creative destruction. Okay, someone mentioned Masao as very good, Masao's destructive character. I think Don mentions that. And so we have a notion of creative destruction in economics. And as I explain in a minute, that plays an important role in economic growth in these days, at least in the modern economies. So formally, economic restructuring or creative destruction is defined as the process where old and inefficient production arrangements are destroyed and replaced by new and efficient production arrangement. So it is similar to critical discourse in the sense that the new ideas, in the sense of economics related to economic production, but nonetheless, the new ideas challenges the incumbents, destroy the status quo, and establish a new regime. And also the new regime is then challenged and eventually replaced by newer regimes. And that is a process of a creative destruction. And what we find in the Japanese economy is a lack of creative destruction. In this sense, the Japanese economy, too, has been uninteresting. And this, the Japanese economy being not interesting, has a lot to do with both the success of the Japanese economy in the post-war rapid economic growth and the continued stagnation after the 1990s. So to explain this, I need to get into a little bit more into economics and think about how the economy grows. And roughly speaking, there are two ways for an economy to grow. The one is to increase the amount of inputs. So you work harder by bringing in more machines so that you can make more. The other is to increase the output without increasing in inputs. So this is what we call the productivity growth or technological progress or innovation. And when the economy is poor and trying to catch up with more advanced economies, the first type of growth strategy works. You add more using the technology or borrowing the technology or stealing the technology from more advanced economies and just work harder and buy more machines and grow. And this has been a growth of catch-up economy, including the Japanese economy in the 1960s and 1970s. So the lack of critical discourse or lack of creative destruction actually was helpful. There was not so much to destroy in Japan, and they didn't have to come up with an innovation. They knew the Japanese economy, they knew what they need to do to grow. You borrow the technology from more advanced economies and work hard. And as Masao argues in this paper, the wartime slogan of national unity really continued to do contributed to the post-war period and continued into the post-war period to achieve economic superpower. So there was no role of innovation or creative destruction. But after economy has caught up or became closer to a matured economy, so this is more like the 1980s and 1990s in Japan, the things started to look different. Technological progress became more important source of economic growth. And this has been happening in all matured economies.